noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where I launched the live program. This is a call-in program. And in that capacity, I am accepting calls at 617-396-4958. That number again is 617-396-4958. And I am awaiting the arrival of my guest, who is Dr. Patrick Moore. Dr. Moore has been a leader in the international environmental field for more than 40 years. He is the co-founder of Greenpeace, where he served for 9 years as president of Greenpeace in Canada and 7 years as the director of Greenpeace International. As the leader of many campaigns, Dr. Moore was a driving force shaping policy and direction, while Greenpeace became the world's largest environmental organization. And Dr. Moore's book is called Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Their Threats of Doom. I mean, apparently this is a critique of Greenpeace, which he says got to the level where, and I suppose this is the type of corruption that we would find often in many cases, where basically, let me just see, where is Dr. Moore? Okay, we're awaiting Dr. Moore. Hello, Dr. Moore. Let me just. All right, so I'm just asking that Dr. Moore log in. Anyway, it's a topic that interests me mainly because this is, we're all so, like, in a sense, almost, I don't want to use the word conditioned, but I suppose why not? Let me just go live on YouTube here, and then we'll really be rolling. It's amazing what you can do now. That we're all conditioned to view environmental problems, if they are, in a very heightened light, to the point where we all have become armchair scientists. We all think every time there's a major weather change, whether it be toward super cold or super hot, or whether there be a natural disaster, whether it be forest fires or tsunamis or earthquakes or volcanoes, weather change, whether it be toward, or whatever it may be, we often become sort of, I guess you might say, armchair, scientists. We all think we know what it is. We all suddenly are assuming that this is a man-made catastrophe. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not environmental problems. I mean, I actually, on this issue, I tend to be a bit on the green side. Like, I don't think it's necessary that we use so much plastic every day. I remember when Starbucks, for example, they got rid of the plastic straw, which I think was not a bad idea, given the fact that there are millions of these things dumped in the ocean every day and that they are not dissolvable. They're around for who knows how many centuries. But what they did is, of course, they replaced that with an even more plasticky cap of their drink. So maybe if they had been more sensible, they could have found another solution to the problem. But I'm not against that. I don't think we need to have plastic bags so much at the supermarket. We could use paper bags. These things are not good for the environment. I mean, I think that the best approach to it is good, solid public relations, and or what we might in the broad sense call propaganda, and I mean that in the best sense, combined with perhaps some local policy. Like, I have no problem with the fact that here in my own home state of Massachusetts, the town of Concord has banned the use of plastic bags in their supermarkets. Does everybody really have to bring home a plastic bag, and that plastic gets dropped in a landfill and it stays there for 1,000 years? And that's who knows how many per day. So I bring this up only because I do tend to be a bit on the green side on these issues. Here he is. And in that sense, I support those sorts of efforts. Dr. Patrick Moore, thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Hello. I'm sorry.
No, this is great. I'm glad you're aboard. Let me just do a quick proper introduction. Dr. Patrick Moore has been a leader in the international environmental field for more than 40 years. He is the co-founder of Greenpeace and served for 9 years as president of Greenpeace Canada and 7 years as the director of Greenpeace International. As a leader of many campaigns, Dr. Moore was a driving force, shaping policy and direction while Greenpeace became the world's largest environmental activist organization. Now, Dr. Moore, you are the author of Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Their Threats of Doom. So, I was just talking a little bit about how, generally speaking, I consider myself to be a bit on the green side in that I see nothing wrong, for example, with supermarkets not using plastic. Why do we need so much plastic in landfills where it stays in there for 1,000 years? You know, I don't think we need so many plastic straws. You know, there are little things we can do to tweak the environment and just improve making things a bit more organic and a bit more biodegradable. But you've been on the front lines of raising national, international awareness in this issue, and yet you're critical of the organization that you helped found, Greenpeace. So why don't we talk a little bit about you and how you got into Greenpeace and then what happened?
Well, Charles, I was in my PhD years at the University of British Columbia studying ecology, which was a pretty new word back in the early 1970s. But it was the height of the Cold War and the Vietnam War and the threat of all-out nuclear war. And it was the time of the emergence of the new environmental consciousness back then in the late 60s and early 70s.
Sure.
And I was swept up in that. And I joined a small group in a church basement in Vancouver called the Don't Make a Wave Committee. And we became Greenpeace, sailing a boat across the Pacific against U.S. hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska. I was on that crew and stayed 15 years with Greenpeace, so that's a pretty long story. I wrote a book previously titled Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, The Making of a Sensible Environmentalist, which documents that entire 15 years. But we started with a noble cause to save civilization from all-out nuclear war and to clean up the world's environment. And we gradually became so successful that we had a big payroll, and fundraising came to the kind of top of the list of priorities. And all of a sudden, people were starting to make things up in order to get people to give the money. And before long, Greenpeace became a racket peddling junk science, which they have been for the last 30 years. Mm-hmm. And they're no longer out in the open. They're behind closed doors. It is just a racket. And they're saying things that are completely incorrect. And, you know, you're thinking about plastic, for example. Plastic is one of the most important inventions in the world. As a matter of fact, life invented plastic 3 billion years ago. Cellulose is a form of plastic. It's a polymer of glucose. And so cotton is plastic. Paper is plastic. Wood is plastic because they are made of polymers that are based on carbon, just like polyethylene and polystyrene and polyvinyl chloride. So these have been some of the most important materials we've ever invented. But they talk about plastic leaching toxins into the ocean. Mm. Is that why we package most of our food in it and wrap our food with plastic wrap? No, it's because it's totally sterile and non-toxic and prevents our food from spoiling and going bad. So the whole sort of demonization of plastic is basically a proxy for the war on fossil fuels, because plastics are almost all made from fossil fuels. And so that's what's at the bottom of this. The fact of the matter is, plastic in the ocean, and you've heard about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, mm-hmm. twice the size of Texas.
Yes.
You'll see in my book proves that garbage patch is non-existent. Mm-hmm. There is no such thing. But people will believe stories about things that are either invisible or remote. And that is the main thesis of my book, is that all the scare stories today are about things that are invisible, like CO2 and radiation, or so remote that nobody can observe them for themselves, like polar bears and coral reefs, and the Great Pacific Garbage Patch 2,000 miles at sea. An aerial photograph actually satellite photograph from outer space, a composite of the entire Pacific Ocean taken over the years so that they get everywhere without clouds at a certain time, shows nothing. Absolutely no garbage patch.
So you mean they've made this whole thing up out of whole cloth?
Yes, it is completely fictitious.
Okay.
But they get away with it because no one can look out their window and see, yeah, that is a huge garbage patch twice the size of Texas.
They have the entire media backing it up. They've got UN NGOs set up to back it up. They've got everybody in line to basically continue to promulgate what you're saying is a myth regarding the great dump in the ocean.
Exactly, and with the exception of discarded fishing gear, particularly nets, which are out there in the ocean floating around, interfering and catching fish, they call them the ghost nets. Those should be put back on the boat and brought to shore by the fishermen.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the main deep sea plastic. Otherwise, a piece of floating plastic, like one of those little plastic floats that pulls a net up in the ocean for fishing,
right?
They provide a habitat for barnacles to grow on in the same way that pieces of wood do. In other words, a piece of plastic, inert piece of plastic in the ocean, is no worse than a piece of wood. As a matter of fact, they are positive because they provide habitat, places for species to lay their eggs on, species to live in. When I was with Greenpeace, I would purposefully throw tin cans overboard because it's just, a tin can. And they go, oh my God, you're polluting the sea. I say, no, some creature is going to use that as a house down on the bottom when it gets there. But
don't some of these things hurt sea animals? Like, for example, the 6-pack plastic of beer. Doesn't that hurt, like get wrapped up in a turtle or a fish and really damage them?
It has happened, but they've pretty much got rid of those in many beer varieties. They should actually get rid of those. I think
sure.
They are something that, but the main point, you talked about landfills. That's the real point, Charles, is that they are putting 50% of U.S. municipal waste in landfills, almost all of which is combustible. And if you go through the Twin Cities airport, you will see the trash cans have waste to energy on them, written on them, because all of that combustible garbage, the plastic and the paper and the wood from demolition of buildings, can be burned to make electricity. The European countries as a whole get over 5% of their total electricity from burning trash. And they do it cleanly in modern facilities that have all the pollution control on them. China's doing the same thing, so is Japan. But the United States and Canada are way behind on this. And one of the main reasons is that the green movement is against fire. Mm-hmm. It's hard to believe that fire was what actually was the basis of civilization in the first place, tens of thousands of years ago. And now we have an environmental movement that is against burning anything, not just fossil fuels. They're against burning wood. They're against burning trash.
That's partially why there's so many big forest fires. Like I read that. Yes. We should talk about the theory of global warming. But before we do, I think that some of these enormous forest fires in California, even the governor there, Newsom, has admitted that this is largely due to bad forest management. They're not clearing out the dead wood in the bottom. They're not keeping roads functioning so that they can create. In other words, forests need to be essentially managed in the same way that a farmer manages a field of wheat. You can't just leave it. If you leave it to go, then and just not touched, then it's going to be more susceptible to fires. And that contrasts well to, for example, in Germany, which has a lot of big forests, has always had forests. They're very, very careful about managing those forests, so they have very few major fires like that. But having said that, and your book again is Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. We now have a culture, particularly amongst younger people, who are so afraid of these environmental catastrophes, these theories, that they just don't think that there's much of a future. Some of this has been fueled by that that young girl in Sweden, Greta Thunberg, and who almost has like a cult-like figure, and that they are so convinced that not just global warming, but all of these things are connected to some kind of evil man-made conspiracy on the part of greedy corporations or the part of civilizations that's going to lead to a huge apocalypse, a complete breakdown and collapse of the entire world. And, look, I tend to be an environmentalist. I tend to think that we can take measures to be more green. I mean, I drive a hybrid car because one of the reasons I'm proud that it has less emissions in the atmosphere. I don't like air pollution, but at the same time, I mean, this kind of like Chicken Little, the sky is falling, henny penny stuff. I take a very jaundiced side of that. I don't see any major catastrophes. What say you? I mean, on that?
Well, it's been with us since the beginning of time, Charles. The doomsday scenarios, the end is nigh, you will perish in flames. That's on the cover of my book, because that's what they're saying. They're saying the world will become too hot for life, when in fact we are in a colder period of Earth's climate now than we have been for 250 million years, when the last ice age ended, which was called the Karoo. We are in an ice age. That's why the poles are covered in ice. And up to about 5 million years ago, for the previous 250 million years, there had been no ice on the poles of the Earth, and the Canadian Arctic islands were forested with giant camels roaming in them. This is a recent phenomenon from a geological point of view, the cool climate that the Earth is in today. The average temperature of Earth is less than 60 degrees Fahrenheit, just barely, 59 point something. That's not warm. That is cool. So then, at times in the past, the average temperature has been in the 70s and even up to the 80s.
So then these things where we see like Arctic ice falling off, and they say that Antarctica's melting and that you now can travel through the Northwest Passage and all this stuff. Is this all some kind of a hoax?
Yes, it is. Antarctica is actually growing. It's in the media this morning. The great conundrum, why haven't our computer models predicted this? We know so much less about how the climate works than we know how it does work. And one thing they've done is they've tricked everybody into thinking that something invisible, carbon dioxide, is going to end the world, when in fact it's the most important food for all life. It is the building block of life. Carbon is the basis of organic molecules, which is what life is made of. Carbohydrates like sugar and starch and fat are all made with carbon. All life is made with it. And in fact, CO2 is actually lower now in the global atmosphere than it has been for almost all the history of life. It has been declining.
Well, wait a minute. Are you saying that, I mean, first of all, I mean, there have been great national efforts to reduce air pollution. I mean, in this country, we do a very good job of scrubber technology on smokestacks, and generally speaking, our air quality is improving. It has improved every year since, I think, the 1970s, including the last 4 years under Trump. Every year, the air pollution quality gets a little bit better. Isn't that a good thing? I mean, shouldn't we be striving to develop technologies that reduce the amount of carbon that's pumped into the air?
The problem there is people are mistakenly calling carbon pollution. And it isn't carbon. It's carbon dioxide, which is an invisible gas. Carbon is soot. Carbon is diamonds. Carbon is graphite. Carbon is black. CO2 is invisible and is the food for life. And it's a cycle that has been going on since the beginning of life, 3.5 billion years ago. We have had CO2 being emitted by photosynthetic species, plants, in other words. Now we are taking the remains of some of those plants, which were turned into coal and gas and oil in the Earth's surface. We're taking those and putting the CO2 back in the environment, into the atmosphere that those plants absorbed in the first place millions of years ago. But the fact of the matter is anybody can look this up. CO2 has declined precipitously in the global atmosphere as a result of life sucking it up and putting it in the sediments in the form of fossil fuels to a minor degree, but mainly in the form of calcium carbonate, which is limestone, which is the shells of all the marine species that learned to make 500 million years ago, learned to make armor plating for themselves. The coral reefs, the shellfish, the crabs and shrimp, all of these species that make a hard shell around their soft bodies are taking carbon dioxide from the sea, combining it with calcium in the sea, making calcium carbonate, which is what limestone is. All the limestone deposits, nearly all of them on the Earth, are of life origin from these species. That's what's been drawing down the CO2. But the alarmists want you to think the Earth began in 1850, like at the beginning of the industrial era. And it's true that CO2 has increased since then due to our CO2 emissions, which is a totally positive thing to restore a balance to the global carbon cycle, which was out of whack because of life, which is ironic. But we have put it back into a balance again by bringing some of that CO2 back out of those deposits. Cement, for example, is made of limestone, being slaked and turned into carbon dioxide and calcium oxide. And that CO2 is also contributing to our emissions to the environment, the manufacture of cement. This is bringing about a new balance to the carbon cycle. So inadvertently, we have actually stopped CO2 from going down to levels that would be too low for life to exist, which is about 150 parts per million. It went down to 180 during the last glaciation. This is all in my book, and it's a bit too
fascinating,
complex.
Right? But it's fascinating theory. So
but
then, basically,
believe me, the CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere is not pollution. It is food for life, and the whole Earth is greening as a result of that CO2 being put into the atmosphere, and that is proven. It is not proven even slightly that CO2 is responsible for the slight warming of just over 1 degree Celsius, just over 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 300 years. The little ice age peaked in 1700. Since then, the Earth has warmed gradually. It's the modern warm period. It's a perfectly natural phenomenon. It happened during the Roman warm period and the medieval warm period. It's in 1,000-year cycles. Anybody can look this up. In fact, the Earth is gradually cooling over the last 6,000 years, but there's ups and downs as we go into the cooling.
So we're in a slight natural curve up that eventually will peak and plateau and then go back down over the next maybe centuries, if not millennia.
If it sticks with the 1,000-year cycle, it'll be about 200 years more of slight warming, which might take us up another degree or so, and then it will drop back down again. And we don't know much beyond that. But if everything goes according to the last 2.6 million years, where there have been 45 glacial events, the last one ending 20,000 years ago and coming into this interglacial period, if it continues like that, we will begin to slide now into the next glacial maximum over an 80,000-year period. These are long cycles, the glacial cycles. Well, long in our sense of measuring time. 100,000 years is a second in geological time. And people have to get their head around how old this Earth is and how long life has been here and how much has happened that they don't know about before 1850.
So, Patrick, you are one of the scientists that's been there at the very beginning of the environmental movement. You're one of the founders of Greenpeace, which is still the world's preeminent environmental organization. And yet, what you are saying with regard to global warming and regard to fossil fuels is completely contrary to the vast majority of scientists, the mainstream of science, which says that we need to stop using fossil fuels because it's destroying the environment, because it's going to run out, because it's dirty, and that we are moving toward catastrophic levels of global warming. How do you account for that? Why is it then that the scientific consensus is that we are experiencing the former, and how do they arrive at that, and why?
Well, back to the thesis of my book, because most of the scare stories are based on things that are invisible or so remote that nobody can observe them for themselves, the public has to depend on the activists, the media, the politicians, and the scientists, all of whom, the scientists on serial government grants to do this work. And then they say the science is settled, but we must have more grants to study it more for some reason. If it's settled, you wouldn't think they'd have to do that. But they do. And we depend on them to tell us the truth, even though they have their entire career staked into it. into that scare story.
Into the
If
theory.
that scare story is blown away as being fictitious, they lose their income from advertising, donations, science grants, votes from politicians promising to save your grandchildren from a certain death because of climate change. All of that is trillions of dollars of economic activity aimed at scaring you into giving them money. And that's what's going on in the world today.
This gets to a political question, which is, why is our government giving grants to scientists only to go along with global warming theory? Why aren't they giving grants to you? Why aren't they giving grants to people in the scientific community who might have an alternative opinion? I mean, what do they get out of it?
They get fear in the populace out of it. And we have two choices when we look to the future. We don't know the future. That's why the crystal ball is a myth. The crystal ball is not an oracle or a soothsayer or something that knows the future. And a climate model in a computer is no better than a crystal ball in predicting the future. The world is chaos. And we can't predict the weather more than a few days out, never mind what the climate's going to be like in 2050. And so they can get away with this by using fear. Now, there's two choices for the future: hope and fear. If you have hope in your heart, you work towards positive things. If you have fear in your heart, you can be stampeded into any negative situation. And that's what's going on right now. These policies of net zero and phase out fossil fuels, that's the end of civilization. There's things called tractors and combines and other heavy equipment that is growing the food out in the fields, unless you want to go back to 80% of the people in agriculture. It's those machines using the fossil fuels that grow the food for the people in the cities that is brought in by big trucks, 50 tons at a time at night, to stock the shelves so that the people on the 30th floor don't starve to death the next day, because you can be sure they're not growing their own food up there. And so these people in the city have been duped into thinking the country people, who are now a minority in society compared to the past when almost everybody lived on the land and only a few wealthy, lucky people lived in cities. Now almost the majority of people live in cities, and they've been duped into believing the people in the country who are drilling and plowing and cutting and fishing and logging and mining and drilling are the enemy of the earth, when in fact the only reason those people are doing that is to keep the people in the city alive with energy, materials, and food. Those three categories of things. And if those are not delivered to the center of the city, you couldn't live there.
That's right. They would collapse.
They would collapse. And also there wouldn't, if we stop using fossil fuels, say in the next little while, there wouldn't be a tree left on this planet within a few years, because that would be the only energy supply that you would have.
Well, they say that when the early colonialists came to this country and came to my own state of Massachusetts, the Pilgrims and Puritans, they found kind of like meadows. There weren't that many forests because apparently the Native Americans were slashing and burning as their main means of hunting. So today, I believe in America, we have more forested land than we ever had 200 or 300 years ago. I mean, it's in a sense, you could go into a forest here in Massachusetts and you find stone walls because they used to be farms. Now they're forests. So, in a sense, we have much more of a proliferation of green space, if you will, today than we had in the past. And yet, our younger people are meant to feel guilty over building buildings and highways and parking lots and asphalt. This is somehow violating something. And it gets me to believe that there is almost somewhat of a religious cult-like element to this. It's a worship of the earth, the Gaia principle, that people think that the earth is like a living being itself and that to be venerated. They're not thinking scientifically, in other words. They're not looking at what you're talking about right now. It has more to do with some kind of a pantheistic, New Age conception, which has kind of wormed its way into scientific thought. What do you think?
Well, science is basically dead at this point because it's been taken over by politics and cult religion. And that's just a fact. And my book clearly in 11 chapters with 11 different examples shows that none of these scare stories are valid. Like the polar bears, for example, are actually growing in numbers tremendously. And the reason for that is something no one's ever heard of. You'd think they would have, because it's fairly important, that in 1973, when wildlife biologists realized that the polar bear population was declining due to overhunting, because it had become easy to fly up there and hire an Inuit guide and get a big rug for in front of your fireplace. So the polar bears were declining and we're down to about 10,000 at the most. Today, there's at least 30 and probably 35,000 polar bears, because this is one of the greatest conservation successes of the 20th century. And yet the children are being taught that the beautiful polar bears are dying. They show a picture of a starving polar bear in National Geographic and say, this is what climate change looks like. When in fact, starvation is the main cause of polar bear death, because they're a top predator and nothing else kills them until they get too old. There's no nursing homes for predators up there in the Arctic, or anything for that matter, and everything dies eventually. So if you just show pictures of things dying all the time, people are going to get the idea that everything's going to die. Well, they're right about that, but everything's going to be born too. And so people have to get an understanding of the fact that death is not the end of the world. And I honestly believe that the end is nigh, the doomsday, end times, apocalypse thinking is a projection of one's own fear of death. I do not fear death, and therefore I don't have this apocalyptic thing in me, this cult feeling that oh my God, we're all going to die. Well, yeah, I guess so.
Right.
Face it.
That's part of the cycle. It's a cycle.
What's going to happen to you.
It's a cycle of life. We're not immortal. And no. I also think that there might be, and this is maybe I'm putting a little tin hat on here, so be it, that in the 1960s, the Hudson Institute did a commission headed by the economist John Kenneth Galbraith of Harvard. And they basically studied how to implement a world socialist order, basically, to put it in a nutshell. I don't know how they described it, but that's what they did. And this is called the Iron Mountain Report. And their conclusion was that the world population would have to come to believe two things were imminent. Number one, global warming, to the degree that the world is going to be burning to a crisp, and we better do something or else we're all doomed. And number two, an invasion by space aliens. And I mean, whether or not this has been implemented or embraced by the sort of the international establishment, this is what's going on. They have pushed this global warming thing using computer projections. And now there is talk about aliens coming. I mean, people are starting to make rumbles about this. So I'm just putting that out there because it does seem to be something that is coming about, and it's very political. What do you think?
I think that, again, this is an attack on science. The first principle of science is observation, either with your eyes or your other senses, or with instruments like X-ray machines and microscopes and telescopes, right? You have to see it to believe it. Seeing is believing, and seeing the same thing over and over again under the same circumstances is starting to become a hypothesis that you need to prove. And then you go about proving it, you show that this is happening, and then you tell the world, please repeat what I have done so that you believe it too. That's called replication in science. So observation, verification, and replication are really the three. It's fairly simple in concept. It's not always easy in reality because there's so many variables, etc. But the fact of the matter is, the people are being told to believe something that they cannot observe or verify, never mind replicate, in their own kitchen, right? Or in front of their own TV. They're shown one dead coral reef, and this is apparently to be extrapolated to the whole world. And coral reefs are another good example. Mm-hmm. The most biodiverse coral reef habitats in the world are in Indonesia, Philippines, in that area. It's called the Coral Triangle. That's the highest biodiversity of corals in the world. Those are the warmest oceans in the world, period. In other words, if the Earth warms, the corals will expand in their habitat into the warmer seas, not shrink.
That makes sense.
It's not Heat is not the enemy of corals. Cold is the enemy of corals. If you look at a map of where the coral reefs are in the world, you won't find a lot of them off Nantucket or Newfoundland or in the Arctic. Right? There's no coral reefs there. The coral reefs are confined to the tropical and some to the subtropical regions of the world because the rest of the oceans are too cold for coral reefs. And yet they've got us duped into thinking that the Great Barrier Reef is dead because the ocean is too hot. The Great Barrier Reef, the ocean there isn't as warm as Indonesia, where there's 600 species of coral and 2,000 species of reef fish, and almost every single class of marine species has more species in the warmest oceans than in the coolest ones. It's just and the same for the land. There's way more species in the tropical rainforest than there is on the North Pole, right?
Right, of course. I mean, it makes perfect sense.
And we are actually a tropical species, Charles. We came from the equator. That's where we evolved. Sure. And the only reason we could come out of Africa was fire, shelter, and clothing. Otherwise, humans would not live outside the equatorial regions.
Right, we had to adapt to colder climates. All right, my guest is Patrick Moore. He is the author of Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. Patrick, there are a couple of other of these stories that I'd like to briefly go over with you. And we've talked about global warming. My understanding is that the entire theory of global warming is based upon computer projections, that if you look at all of the scientists, they're all projecting based on data that's put into computer programs, and then it projects. There's no hard proof that it is leading to the kinds of catastrophes that people are now accepting almost as a matter of faith. I mean, I have a cousin, for example, who lives in Florida who feels that his property is going to be underwater. He doesn't even want to buy the house because 10, 15 years from now, South Florida won't even exist. I mean, that's how fearful people are. And it's all based upon these computer projections. You're pointing out that we're not in any way heading in that direction. And that, in fact, we're actually in a cold, generally in a cold period, or maybe a slight warm uptick in a broader cold period. What about some of these other, these sky is falling stuff? Like, for example, a lot of the things I'm hearing about the slashing and burning going on in the Amazon in Brazil, that if this goes on and if that land loses its jungle quality, its jungle-like quality, and is turned into like farmland or whatever, then that's kind of a lung for the entire world, and it's going to cause a huge collapse in our atmosphere. And that one of the manifestations of that, according to some people that I'm hearing who think they're scientists, everybody now is a scientist. They're telling me that that's why there's huge fires in Siberia, that Siberia is burning, because of this. What about the deal with the Amazon and Siberia?
Well, just before I go into that, Charles, I'll just mention that my book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom, and the catastrophes are things they say are happening already, like the climate catastrophe.
Right. Threats
of doom are things that are predicting for the future, like the extinction of polar bears and coral reefs. So it had to be a bit of a clunky title to capture both those concepts in one title, but okay. I think it works.
Yeah.
As far as the Amazon goes, that is one of the least populated parts of the world. Because it is a tropical rainforest, it's not really all that pleasant a place to live. Mm-hmm. But there are cities and people living there, of course. But you fly across Brazil through the Amazon, and you won't believe it. There's like no one down there. There's only forest. It's one of the greenest places on Earth. And the lungs of the Earth is a fake metaphor. They are not the lungs of the Earth. I don't recommend it, but we could burn every single living thing on the planet, and the oxygen level would only go down a teeny amount because it represents previous life and not just present life. So there's no threat to the level of oxygen in the atmosphere. There is a threat to the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because it was sinking to such low levels, down to 180, when life ends around 150. And that happened just 20,000 years ago as the oceans absorbed CO2 from the atmosphere as they cooled in the last glacial maximum. the most recent glacial maximum. A lot of people think when you say the last glaciation, it means there won't be any more. No, it's just the most recent one of 45 that occurred 20,000 years ago. And again, we just have no sense of time in our society. People think in days and weeks and months and years. They do not think in terms of millions and tens of millions of years. And if they would learn to do that, they would see a completely different picture than they're being told today. Because this whole climate change thing is purely political. It is not scientific. It's political and to some extent religious.
Right. Yeah, we've gone over that.
I think it has taken over from the traditional religions because humans need to believe in things about the future. But let's put it this way. A computer model that pretends to predict the future climate is only taking the assumptions that the person built into it and then churning out the result. Now, if you assume that carbon dioxide causes warming and put that in the computer will show you that the world is warming because of carbon dioxide. So they say a climate skeptic is, like myself, is someone who disagrees with the conclusions that other people have drawn. But a climate heretic, like me, is someone who believes in the assumptions from which those people have derived their conclusions. Assumptions and conclusions are two different things in logic. The assumptions are the basic truths that you do believe are real. And then the conclusions follow from those assumptions. I don't believe in the assumption that carbon dioxide is going to make the world too hot for life. As a matter of fact, I know it's false because carbon dioxide has been so much higher in the past world, up to 4, 5, 6, 7 times higher than it is now. And the world didn't come to an end then. As a matter of fact, it was lusher, greener, with more biomass, more life than it is today, where you have the Arctic and the Antarctic, not lifeless, but pretty close to it in a lot of places because you can't live on ice alone.
So then it's your contention, and let me just reiterate this. I know we talked about it, that the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere of the world has actually dropped compared to what it was. And I've heard stories from various people over the years who I've had on as guests, not necessarily scientists, who have said that if you look at like biblical times, which was about 6,000 years ago, you know, the Sahara was green.
Yes, and that, it was for 4,000 years before that too, during the climate optimum, what's called the Holocene climatic optimum, which is this interglacial period's first 6,000 years. The Sahara was covered with goat herders and villages, and it was green. It's a fact and it's known. It's also, though, a fact and it's known. It's not me contending that CO2 has dropped over the millennia. It's known from marine sediment analysis. Those graphs are all available to people. If they just would go and use DuckDuckGo instead of Google and find out, or some other search engine, of which there are many, but I'm using DuckDuckGo now, because it doesn't have algorithms that give me you put up all the bad stories about me in the front.
Right.
And all the other people who are saying the things I'm saying, they seem to think they've become the arbiters of truth.
Well, yeah, that's
in these tech giants.
They're inventing truths in a way, which is what we're talking about right now. You know, when you have the high ground in terms of controlling the means of communication, you can invent truths and suppress what might actually be the truth. And your comments about the lushness of the Sahara, I think that is proven. I mean, even in Roman times, one of the reasons Rome wanted to subdue Carthage is because Carthage had these huge plantations and enormous growth. It was the breadbasket of the world at the time. Today, that's all desert. So, you know, I guess that therefore we could ask, if the world has had a decrease in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then would it therefore not be a good thing scientifically to actually increase it? If we could do through man-made means as a way to revive places like the Sahara, improve the food production and you know, general success in the world?
Well, we don't know, Charles, that CO2 had anything to do with the Sahara being lush. It was the warmth of the climate. And there's no evidence that CO2 caused it, because actually CO2 increased during the period when the Sahara became desert again. Mm-hmm. So it's called the Holocene conundrum, because it flies in the face of the idea that increasing CO2, which it did from 260 to 280 during the 10,000 year period of the Holocene, the Sahara was green for the first part when CO2 was lower. So we have no evidence that CO2 was involved in that greening, but we do have evidence that the warmth was. So we should not be afraid of the Earth becoming warmer. It's been so much warmer in the past. And in fact, sea level does not appear to be dependent as much on the temperature of the Earth as these people are saying. Because in the past 3 interglacials before this one, the sea level was higher, yet CO2 was much lower. So we don't have strong correlations here. And they are making it as if we do, because increasing CO2 from our emissions is occurring, and the temperature continues to go up very slowly. But there's no exponential rise in temperature to follow the exponential rise in CO2 emissions that has occurred since 1950. It's just going along exactly as it did for 300 years.
Right.
It hasn't changed its direction. So there's no hard evidence whatsoever that CO2 is the cause of warming of the Earth. None. It's other factors.
And so
many other factors, like the amount of clouds there are. The whole hydrological cycle is very important in the weather. As you know, when it's raining, there isn't much sunshine coming through. And if the world becomes more cloudy, it will become cooler in general. And if it gets less cloudy, it will become warmer in general, because the clouds reflect sunlight back to space before it even gets down to the Earth. And so the number of factors that are involved in this are so great that no computer model could ever replicate the future. As a matter of fact, like they give credit to Yogi Berra for saying predictions are difficult, especially about the future. Mm-hmm. But in fact, it was Niels Bohr, a Nobel Prize physicist, mm-hmm. who first said that in succinct terms, that it's difficult to predict, to make predictions, especially about the future. As a matter of fact, it's impossible to make accurate predictions about the future 20, 30, 40, 50 years out. Impossible. So we should go right there and say, well, for one thing, that's impossible. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying, you don't really know. You're saying something
Very
that
good
you
point.
don't really know.
Exactly. And they say it with such certainty that they can predict 100 years out. We need honest scientists who are going to look at this thing. But the problem is that it has become politicized for a lot of different reasons, with a lot of different agendas, to the point where younger people, they've scared the bejesus out of them. I mean, they feel the sky is falling every time there's a little snowstorm. We hear, oh, it's global warming. Every time there's a hot day, global warming. Everything is, suddenly everybody's walking around like they're their own scientists. They all think that, oh, I've heard this from the authorities. I mean, everybody thinks they know what the hell is going on. Now, excuse me, let me ask you about a couple of other of these various things that people in that generation that I know are saying. There's a major backlash against GMOs, which is genetically modified food that has done things like help crops resist pests and other such things. And there are a lot of conspiracy theories around this, which means that it does something to the human body. It does something to our genetic system. What about that? Should we be concerned about that?
Well, for one thing, it's invisible. So that's why it's a chapter in my book.
Yes.
It must be invisible because no one has put it on their hand and showed it to us on TV, right? What this bad thing is, right? But more importantly, Charles, this is so amazing. It hasn't got a name, whatever it is. Never mind a chemical formula. All material has a chemical formula, gas, liquid, and solid. There is nothing on this earth that you cannot break down into what elements and molecules make it up, whether it's a rock or the air or your body or whatever, right? they don't have a name for it because it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. So it is one of the few invisible scare stories that is actually based on something that isn't there. Whereas, CO2 is there, it's invisible, but it's there. And radiation is invisible, but it's a real thing. The ultraviolet radiation from the sun can give you cancer. The sun is actually categorized as a carcinogen. Salt, for example, table salt, it's an essential nutrient. If we didn't get table salt, sodium chloride, we would die. But eat 3 or 4 tablespoons of it at once, and you will also die, right? So things which are essential at low levels are often toxic or fatal at high levels. And when they're invisible, and you can't even see them in the first place, you're not able to see what's going on. And so people can make up any story they want. That is the idea of fake invisible catastrophes and threats of doom, because the future is invisible too. People don't seem to recognize that, but the future is invisible, except for they know the rain is coming in 3 days, or the storm is coming in 2 days, or whatever. They know they can see it coming from a satellite, so it's not exactly as if it's a brilliant prediction of the future.
Right,
but,
right.
And meteorology is very well advanced in its ability to predict, even to predict, not with great accuracy, but maybe a week out in some cases, even because they know that one pattern will follow another pattern more often than not. But when it comes to predicting the climate in 2050, no, sorry, you can't do that. There's no such thing as a crystal ball that can do that. It's a mythical object, the crystal ball, and they're pretending that the computer is an actual crystal ball, which is wrong.
Interesting metaphor,
yeah. Amazon.com, by the way, and it is the #1 best-selling new release in the subjects of environment and ecology on Amazon.com after only 2 weeks, with not that much publicity yet. We're just gearing up.
Your book is? Wonderful.
Yeah,
I'm glad to hear that. So anyway, Patrick Moore, you are the author of Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. I remember years ago when I did a radio program on, I suppose you would conventionally call it a right-wing station with a lot of conspiracy theories. And eventually I couldn't take it anymore because every day there was another, the chemtrails and this and that, and they're coming to an end in the world. And I'm like, look, I can't live like that. I need to feel that there's a future in the world. I'm a father. I want to think that the next generation is going to be okay. It's just not, it's not how I roll, and that's sort of my approach here. I like the idea that when you need to see something, or you need to see hard evidence. I had a guy on my show maybe a couple of years ago who insisted that there was aliens from outer space landing in Colorado and that they were coming off the ship. And I'm like, okay, fine. Send me a round trip ticket. I'll meet you at the airport. You will drive me to this place. And if I see this with my own eyes, then you'll come on the show and I'm with you. But eventually he admitted that he hadn't seen this. So I take that same view with regard to most of these theories. We need to see something real, something concrete, more than just some computer blips on the screen with projections and stats and data. I mean, I'm actually studying statistics right now as a college course, and I can tell you it's very subjective, and it's very much based upon the opinions of those gathering the data. And so I think actually a more scientific view of these things. And I hope that your book will lead to others doing the same, because you basically lay it out in clear terms, what is real and what is maybe questionable or not real. So, Patrick.
In some cases, Charles, I lay out something that is absolutely not true. That people will not believe how, especially with the GMO, as I just mentioned.
Yes.
If it hasn't got a name, it doesn't exist. At least we don't know it exists. You got to be able to say that it's made of calcium or something, or carbon or anything, but they don't know what it is. But my main point on the future, the present we can see, except for the invisible things and the polar bears and the coral reefs. That's my point about the present time, is that we can't even see many of the scare stories that are about things that are supposedly happening now. But with regard for the future, intelligent hope is so much better than apocalyptic fear, because all fear does is make you cringe and be afraid, and you don't learn much when you're cringing in fear. When you have intelligent hope, you keep thinking, you keep hoping that the world will be a better place. And I would say that we've gone from an administration in the US, I'm Canadian actually, so I don't vote in your country, but the same thing's happening in Canada as is happening in the US politically. I would say that we should all stop fearing the future so much, because the future is bright if we make the right decisions. But we've gone from a regime in the US that was based on hope and promise and improvement to one that is about a dark winter, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, speaking
about
of
ending the fossil fuels that will hurt the poor people the most of anybody.
well, you brought this up. I mean, the day after Biden was installed, and I do use the word installed, he signed an executive order ending the XL pipeline, which of course hurts both Canada and the United States. I know on this side of the aisle, it's loss of upwards of 100,000 jobs, people who overnight are not going to be able to have work. And you have all of these pipelines going to be sitting there collecting moss now, and they're not going to be built. And that from an environmental standpoint, this means that either the oil is going to have to be shipped into the United States by rail or by truck, where it actually is more dangerous in terms of having spills, or it's going to go to China. So, it doesn't make sense. I mean, other than that, it's maybe a gift to the oil companies to rise the price of oil because of developing more scarcity. It comes to my mind. Things like the Paris Climate Agreement, which China and Russia are not members of. That's going to essentially tell the United States and Canada and the Western democracies that we need to start restricting our carbon emissions. We have to restrict our use of fossil fuels, while the rest of the world can continue doing that, and they don't have the technologies that we have to make sure that it's cleaner when it enters the atmosphere. So these things are very based upon, fear, as you say, certainly propaganda. And, we're just trying to sort of make sense of it all. But yes, I think that your overall view on this is that we are entering into a negative, pessimistic time that does not view...
As sort of a final point, I'm a director of the CO2 Coalition in Arlington, and we're a group of engineers and scientists, top engineers and top scientists, just by invitation only to our 60-odd members. And our whole job is to convince people that carbon dioxide is entirely beneficial for the future of the Earth, of all life on Earth, and is not a pollutant. And having the EPA call it a pollutant was one of the most backward steps in science and politics that has been taken in the last century. CO2 is the food for life, the basis of life. And that's what we're doing in the CO2 Coalition every day, is trying to help people understand that. So it's co2coalition.org. And along with looking for my book on Amazon, I hope people go to the CO2 Coalition for really good knowledge of what this molecule really means to life on Earth.
Well, Patrick, I will put up a link to that on this YouTube interview, and my interview's heard on about multiple other platforms. And, because I think that you're onto something here. I've really enjoyed talking with you today. I hope that you will come back with me from time to time and we stay in touch and continue to discuss these issues, because it's very important for public awareness. Anyway, listen, I want to thank you again for joining me today. Patrick Moore.
Thank you, Charles.
Okay.
Anytime.
Thanks so much. And again, Patrick Moore is the author of Fake Invisible Catastrophes and the Threats of Doom. Have a great afternoon, everyone. God bless America, and take care.